Thank you for that really kind introduction. You've really set the bar very high now. Thank you to the IAS for the invitation to speak, and thank you for featuring this really important topic on HIV and aging, and one that I think we have still a lot of work to do, not just in the region that I am in the Asia Pacific, but worldwide. And I hope I will highlight some of the priorities in my talk in the next 30 minutes or so. But first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land which we meet today. And I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. So, this is the outline of my talk, and I'll start by sharing with you the global epidemiology of older people living with HIV and what we might expect in the next decade. I'll then share with you some emerging data on health outcomes in individuals growing older with and without HIV. And reflecting on some of the key findings from this study, I'll review the current gaps in our HIV care programs and highlight areas which I think that we still need to work on in order to build better models of person-centered care. So, among the 39 million people living with HIV globally, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 4 men are over the age of 50, and they make up about 24% of the total global population of people living with HIV. Now, some of you might think these numbers are small and, still manageable. What is quite worrying is the fast increasing numbers of older people with HIV. Now, this section of the population pyramid in the widest segment represents individuals in their 40s, and in the next decade will age across the threshold of 50 years. And they alone make up 26% of the global population of people living with HIV. So we have a large number of the population who are aging. Now, the burden of older people living with HIV is also disproportionately distributed. We have close to 50% of them residing in East and South Africa, and the largest numbers are in countries and regions with low or middle income economies, and this sort of highlights the impending burden on the health system in the years to come. Now, in this study that was published now almost 10 years ago in the age HIV cohort, what was described by the group was that individuals living with HIV, people living with HIV, had a higher frequency of chronic comorbidities, almost 5 to 10 years earlier compared to people without HIV. Now, in recent years, the same group have updated their study and highlighted and essentially looked at what was the trajectory of health outcomes in the same group of individuals when they followed them up for a period of 6 years. Now, in this analysis, what they found was that although people living with HIV started off with a higher frequency of chronic comorbidities compared to individuals without HIV, the rate at which new comorbidities occurred over the period of 6 years was similar in the two groups. However, with each additional comorbidity, this was associated with an increased risk of death, an increased risk of over 3 times for each additional comorbidity. Now, the impact of HIV on long-term health outcomes is perhaps more obvious in this analysis, where they investigated disabilities associated with chronic comorbidities. Now, this was measured using a health matrix called Disability Adjusted Life Years, or DALY, and this takes into account the number of years lost due to disabilities associated with having a chronic comorbidity or due to premature death. And as you can see in the graph, there was people living with HIV experienced significantly higher increases in healthy years of life lost compared to individuals without HIV as they grew older. And this was largely attributed to deaths due to non-AIDS defining cancers and NCDs. What they also found was that individuals who experienced the greatest increase in healthy life years lost were people living with HIV who had a prior history of late care presentation, who had a prior history of AIDS, and who had a prior exposure of NRTIs, toxic NRTIs. And this has got significant global implications because this profile essentially describes the vast majority of people living with HIV in resource-limited settings today. So there were a number of key points from this study which stood out to me. And the first was the increased mortality of non-AIDS cancers and NCDs, and these are essentially health conditions which are preventable. The second was people living with HIV experience a higher degree of disability, and compared to individuals without HIV, despite experiencing the same numbers or same increase in chronic comorbidities. And this largely speaks to what we often hear or what we often read of poor quality of life in people living with HIV, despite them having suppressed viral loads. And the last was the HIV legacy effects and its impact on long-term outcomes in people living with HIV. And some of these legacy effects, like late presentation to care, are still persistent issues today. So can we do better? Reflecting on some of the findings from this study, it gives us an opportunity to relook at the gaps in our current practices and rethink how we might optimize and personalize care across the life course of people living with HIV. And I have grouped this into three main priority areas. The first is optimizing prevention and screening for NCDs and malignancies. In this table, it represents the cardiovascular risk profile of participants from the EuroCEDA cohort. Now, the EuroCEDA cohort is a cohort of over 100 clinics in HIV clinics across 34 countries in Europe, Argentina, and Israel. And what you see is a high frequency of various modifiable cardiovascular risk factors. 1 in 5 individuals in this study also had a moderate to high Framingham risk. Now, what the investigators did was they prospectively followed up the participants' data to assess the proportion of individuals who successfully modified their cardiovascular risk factors while in clinical care. And this was what they found after over 7,666 years of person-years of follow-up, despite 80% of participants achieving viral suppression. Modifications of cardiovascular risk factors were still poor across the board. Now, there are also gaps in screening for malignancies. Now, this study was done in the DC cohort, and investigators assessed both incidence of cancers as well as screening practices in close to 8,000 individuals in the DC cohort, which is a cohort of people living with HIV in clinical care. And individuals at risk of cancer were defined as those who didn't have a prior history of cancer, and screening eligibility was assessed based on published guidelines. And as you can see, highlighted in the pink bar, there were significant shortfalls in screening practices across all of the cancers assessed, and less than 60% of eligible participants were screened overall. So the findings from this study and the previous study on NCDs highlight that we have a lot of work to do in terms of optimizing our screening practices, especially as the demographics of our patients in clinic grow older. Now, another interesting finding from this study was that the investigators found that 41% of incident breast cancer occurred at ages earlier than the recommended age for screening, 17% for colorectal cancer and 8% for lung cancer. And this raises an increasingly debated question on whether or not we should have tailored guidelines for NCDs and malignancies for people living with HIV. if you review the literature, there are a number of limitations to the utility of guidelines for NCDs and cancers which have been raised, and I've summarized some of them here. Many of the guidelines that we use today to manage and screen people living with HIV are adapted from guidelines intended for the general population, and so they don't, or they have poor considerations of unique risks for risks which are unique for people living with HIV. For example, the extent and duration of immunodeficiency, chronic immunoactivation, exposure to toxic antiretrovirals, co-infection with oncogenic viruses, as well as perhaps a high and longer exposure for smoking and alcohol use. Many of our clinical trials also do not include people living with HIV as part of their patient pool in trials, and so there's limited evidence to refine treatment algorithms, and this limitation has largely been raised in the literature related to treatment for non-AIDS defining cancers. Many of our guidelines are also age-specific, and we know that for some conditions and some cancers, the cancers can occur early in people living with HIV, and this may not align with the risks in the population. However, because many health schemes reimburse subsidized screening based on published guidelines for the general population, this in turn impacts access to free screening or earlier screening for people living with HIV, and this becomes a barrier. And finally, there are a number of cancers which are not very common in the general population, particularly lung and anal cancer, despite the burden of these cancers being high in people living with HIV. And so we don't have good guidance on screening. Lung cancer, for example, is expected to be the highest cancer in people living with HIV in the US by 2030. So we do need a lot more evidence, and we need to build the evidence base in order to guide enhanced screening practices and early intervention for NCDs as well as malignancies. The second point I would like to raise is the value of assessing functional outcomes for diseases in people living with HIV. And let me use a hypothetical example to try to explain this. Now, in a lot of our HIV programs, the focus of care is largely on clinical disease and health conditions. Now, the example here is Mr. A, who's 66 years old. He has an undetectable virus, but he has low vision due to cataract. Now, when he goes into the clinic, his consultation is largely going to be focused on the fact that he's got good HIV disease control, and he probably will get a referral to see an ophthalmologist. But does this address all of Mr. A's health concerns? If we probed a little bit further, we might realize that Mr. A actually has a low mood. He is frustrated that he can't read and follow the news anymore because his vision is poor. He's having difficulties preparing meals because he can't read food instructions, and he's lost confidence in driving. And because he can't drive anymore, he no longer makes his weekly visit to the community library, where he usually volunteers and where he mingles with other members in the community. Now, Mr. A lives alone. He doesn't have family support, and this is the reason why he has been delaying his cataract operation, because he doesn't know how he's going to manage after the operation because he lives alone. So, though this is a hypothetical example, it's very relatable, and it essentially highlights that when we focus solely on the health condition without assessing the functional impact in individuals, we lose or we miss opportunities to identify disabilities and vulnerabilities, and this needs to change. As people living with HIV grow older, we need to think about how to expand our HIV treatment programs so that it includes assessments for functional outcomes as well as needs, and this needs to be integrated as part of routine care. There is one example of a framework that allows us to do this is the Integrated Care for Older People, or ICOP. And this is a framework that was introduced by WHO in 2017 under the model of healthy aging. This framework proposes that we monitor an individual for their functional ability or functional capacity, and this can be done routinely in clinic. Now, in this context, an individual's functional capacity is referred to as their intrinsic capacity, and it can be operationalized by measuring mobility, vitality or energy balance, their sensory, hearing and vision, their psychological health and cognition. And all of these domains can be assessed using existing tools, and in studies has also been done in the community setting. In the last 3 to 5 years, there have been a large number of studies which have validated intrinsic capacity in the general older population, and it's been found to be a good tool to identify and predict frailty, disability, as well as mortality. But the utility of this tool in the context of people living with HIV is still poorly understood. We did a small study in UMMC where we recruited 155 participants who were returning to our clinic as part of routine care, and 89 controls from community volunteers. The median age in both groups were 50 years, and people living with HIV had a median duration of 13 years. We assessed the domains of intrinsic capacity using validated tools. And as you can see in this graph here, showing the frequency of deficits in each of the domains, there were really not much difference between people living with HIV and controls, except for cognition. However, when we looked at the cumulative occurrence of deficits, there were twice as many people living with HIV with deficits compared to controls. When we assess the number of intrinsic capacity domains with deficits and the ability to perform instrumental activities of daily living, we found that individuals with a higher number of domain deficits was significantly correlated with difficulties in performing IADL, and this was both in people living with HIV and controls. We also assessed the correlation of intrinsic capacity to other health outcomes and compared this to VAX index, which is another composite tool, but this tool uses parameters which are more clinical based rather than intrinsic capacity, which uses domains which are functional based. And we see that it correlates, intrinsic capacity tends to correlate better with outcomes of quality of life and social participation and loneliness. The intrinsic capacity tool also performed quite well in identifying individuals with frailty when this was measured using the frailty phenotype. So although this study was small and needs to be replicated in a larger, more diverse setting of people living with HIV, what it demonstrates is that there is a utility of using tools which are functional based, and it allows us to identify individuals based on their vulnerabilities. And this potentially can be used in clinic and to complement disease-based monitoring, which a lot of us use as an approach for HIV management. The last point I wanted to raise was on addressing stigma across the HIV and NCD care continuum. There are a number of studies now which have shown that HIV legacy effects, and these includes exposure to toxic antiretrovirals, late presentation to care, AIDS-defining illness, inverse CD4-CD8 ratio, and having longer durations of detectable viremia are all associated with more adverse outcomes in people living with HIV. Now, today we have reconciled some of this, for example, with better and safer antiretrovirals, more efficacious antiretrovirals, but not all of this have been addressed. Delayed presentation to care, for example, still remains a substantial global problem. In this study in the IDEA regions globally, which looked at CD4 counts at presentation. And you see in all regions, with the exception of North America, more than 50% of individuals newly diagnosed with HIV are late presenters. And this was often worse when in low middle income setting and when HIV was diagnosed at an older age. There are a number of factors which contribute to late presentation to care, and I've listed some of them here. But stigma and its intersection with marginalized identities are perhaps one of the hardest to dismantle. Stigma can also affect the NCD care continuum, and in this study done in Kenya, where they used a mixed method approach to study the impact of stigma in individuals newly diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, which is a cancer which has got quite debilitating skin and very visible skin lesions. What they found was that in the stories that were, or in the lived experiences that were raised and were analyzed in among the transcripts of participants, intersectional stigma was a significant dominant factor, and HIV-related stigma particularly was raised in a lot of the stories that were shared. This was followed by cancer-related stigma and, to a lesser extent, skin-related stigma. When they looked at the overall stigma score, this was highest at the point of diagnosis, but this declined with continued engagement in care, and participants related how the high stigma that they felt was contributed to them delaying attending treatment for their Kaposi sarcoma. And similar reports have also been reported with cervical cancer and for depression. What this shows is that there are unwanted effects. The unwanted effects of stigma has got significant impact on both the NCD care cascade as well as the HIV care cascade. And in order to for people living with HIV to age well, we need to address both. So in summary, the highest burden of older people living with HIV are in low middle income settings, and this is growing, these numbers are growing very fast. To build better models of person-centered care, we need a larger evidence base to guide tailored guidelines for NCDs and malignancies, and we need better strategies to optimize prevention and screening practices. We need to integrate functional assessments as part of routine HIV care, and we need to reduce stigma across both the HIV and the NCD care cascade so people living with HIV can age well and with dignity. I'd like to acknowledge my team as well as collaborators that I've worked with, and I'm very grateful to individuals who've contributed data and given me feedback for these slides. Thank you.